And this is my first opportunity to grapple firsthand with new friends and colleagues at this university and at the Foreign Ministry and later in Istanbul, thinking about both regional politics, global politics in an era of change. There's so many things that we are concerned about as scholars of international relations, and today I'm going to focus on global power transitions and shifts in geopolitics. And in some ways, as I mentioned yesterday, Turkey is at the center of the world in many ways in this period of transition, with Ukraine to the north and Syria to the south and Iran to the east, and the world swirling around. We are in a period where countries like Turkey that are rising states, that are seeking a new position, new voice, are very much in play, very much in part of the drama of world politics. And I want to talk about that today. And as you'll see, I am trying to present a liberal perspective. And I know that my dear friend John Mearsheimer was here a year or two ago, and I would just say that everything that John told you is wrong, and so I am going to be here to correct his view. I'm going to be giving a liberal view, but it's actually a little bit more complicated than that, in that the great story of our time is a story of power transitions, and that is a story that realists think a lot about. And I want to play off of the realist view. I want to suggest that that the problems that realists talk about are important problems, but that there are ways in which the world has moved beyond older dynamics of power politics, and there are opportunities for the global system to rise above the past and deal with problems of power in new ways. But we are asking big questions about world politics, about the shift in power and the rise of new states in the system. And obviously the most dramatic rise is the story of China. But everybody, I think everybody, whether you're a realist or a liberal or something else, a Marxist, a constructivist, a feminist, there is no doubt that you believe that power is shifting, that the system is changing, that states are rising and states are declining, that we were in a few years ago a period of unipolar dominance by one state, the U.S., but that has changed. We are moving from a unipolar to, many people would say, a multipolar system. An organization that I work with on occasion, the National Intelligence Council, which is a bureau in government in Washington that tries to study change, study the big picture. Its last publication, called Global Trends, depicted the world moving towards multipolarity. And I don't quite buy that, but it is a story of change. Certainly we aren't in the old world of unipolarity or the Cold War of bipolarity. We're in something new, and that's what makes it very interesting. So there are different ways you can capture this notion of change. I find this particular graph very interesting. It's very long-term. It starts really 1,000 years AD, and it's really a picture of where the economic center of gravity was in the world. And while 1000 AD sounds a little bit like the center of gravity was somewhere around Persia, that isn't quite true. It was very level, the world was, and there was China, which was a dominant economy, India and Europe, there were different centers, but it was very horizontal world of economic activity, agrarian activity mostly. But then we start to see, partly because, and actually mostly because of the British Industrial Revolution, English Industrial Revolution, you start to see the movement of economic activity going towards the West, towards Western Europe. 1940, that was the Western era, the European era, and then after World War II, the U.S. period of ascendancy, and that reaches some kind of high point in 1950, 1960, and then things start to shift. And of course, why? Well, it's about the rise of of the East again, catching up after really 500 years of being behind. It's China, but it's also India, and here you see the center of gravity coming back. It takes 1,000 years, but everything kind of goes around. And it's a story really of the shifting fortunes of societies, of civilizations, of states, and of regions, and it's quite provocative. And this is the background for international politics. The other graph, this is what international relations scholars get excited about or worried about. It's one country in particular, China, which is rising up through 2 decades of double-digit global growth, becoming close to becoming the world's largest economy. Some people say the next decade, after 2020, China will be the largest economy in the world. And so there is a story of this is the power transition. Something is happening. It's global. It's playing out in regions. And then the question is, well, what are the implications? What does it mean? What will happen to the political formations that we've had, the rules, the institutions, global governance, the way in which we have organized our decision-making at the global level? And here, I would say, we have some very classic arguments by eminent scholars who tell us there's a lot to worry about. Paul Kennedy from Yale, Robert Gilpin from my university, Princeton, E.H. Carr, the British historian, have all told the story of power transitions as a story of rising conflict and frequently war. They argue that rising states want to run the show. They want to create their own institutions. They want the international order to reflect their interests. It makes sense. That's what the U.S. did after World War II, to project power, to project and establish your interests internationally, to express your values, all of this part of the drama of power transition. And you get this set of ideas that are out there, people arguing about what it means and mostly making arguments about the rise of conflict, that it's a contested politics, a power transition of contestation over rules and institutions. And it's the most classic way in which international relations scholars talk about power transitions is a kind of structural model where a rising state wins a war. Think of the U.S. after World War II, stepping forward after a great cataclysmic war and building an international order to reflect its interests, to be a kind of global hegemon. And that's the first phase. The second phase is decline. It's the global power becomes less global in its power, becomes less powerful. Decline driven by technology diffusion, innovations springing up elsewhere, relative wage patterns, capital flows, trade expansion, innovative development policies in countries that are trying to catch up, trying to innovate. So you get a kind of, the global power structure has this kind of set of rules and institutions, but the power behind it starts to go down. And then you have what is the third phase, which is a legitimacy crisis or a crisis of governance. The powerful state cannot protect the world order, and it begins to think more domestically about its decline. And other states try to step forward and have their own rules and institutions, their agenda for order building. So the crisis of legitimacy, a gap between power and order, and that's when you think about conflict and war. The fourth period, or the fourth phase of the structural model is, international relations scholars call it really the period of transition, and the new rising state steps forward, either presenting a new world order or acting as a spoiler, that is to say, acting as a country that isn't powerful enough to rewrite the rules, but clearly powerful enough to get in the way of other states. And so you have various scholars, Paul Kennedy, Robert Gilpin, E.H. Carr down here. You have different visions. You have Martin Jacks, the British journalist, who sees China really as the next world hegemon, stepping forward with a new vision of order, a Chinese-centered world order. And I ask you to kind of think about, well, what would that mean? What would a Chinese order look like? And obviously John Mearsheimer as well, having a view about these things. And the general pattern that you see is this view of contestation, and regionally you see specific kinds of crises. So Mearsheimer, as you know, he was here, arguing that there is a kind of moment when the rising state tries to step forward and push the old state out of the region. So Mearsheimer expects that there will be a transition in Asia where China will try to provide new hegemonic services for East Asia, will try to flip allies from the US to China, and there will be a kind of transition of that sort. When rising states rise, international relations scholars say that there are two kinds of dynamics that unfold. One is that rising states will want to do more with their power. They will have an ambition. They will want the world to respect them. They will want to be at the global power conferences, and they will want their ideas embedded in the international order. And secondly, the old rising state, that now is the declining state, will be more worried about its position. It will see the rising state as a threat. And that's the basic realist view, that power generates ambition, and declining states see threats that draws it further into conflict with the rising state. And the problems of anarchy come back. But the question remains, it seems to me, over the next few decades, what will the rising states want? And the most important question, it seems to me, that you can ask is, what will global politics look like when a new set of powerful states rising today are finally in position? And here I would simply say that there are two types of implications that come particularly from China, which is the country that I want to give particular attention to today. One is that if China, and when China becomes the largest economy in the world, it will break historical ground in a variety of ways. One way is simply that it, for the first time in world history, the largest economy will be a developing economy. Will be an economy that's not the leading economy in terms of wealth or technological advance or per capita income. Britain was, the US was in its time, but when China becomes the largest economy, it's going to be still a developing economy. And that's something to think about, because what does that mean China will want to do in the world if it's not the lead state in terms of trade and labor productivity and technological innovation? How will it think about its power when it's not a developed vanguard economy? And it will clearly, it seems to me, bring different values, different agendas to the table. The second new thing that's going to occur when China becomes the largest economy is that it will be the first non-Western economy in 500 years to be the leading economy. And that too is something to think about, because there you have an Asian country taking over the lead position after 500 years of Western dominance. And what does that bring to the table? What cultural and ideological ideas will China, as the leading state, bring to the table? Are there non-Western ideas that are consequential for global order? But to kind of summarize my point, I would simply say that whatever happens, we are watching a kind of slow motion democratic revolution worldwide, where more people in more places, east and west, south, north, are going to have some view about global order. It's not going to be something that is done in Brussels or Washington or the old Western capitals. There are going to be more societies that are going to want to have their views represented. And that's, in some sense, that's the most basic thing I think we know about the future. We know that this power transition is going to be a participatory one where a lot of different cultures and societies and peoples, and a lot of societies and peoples that were on the downside of history for so many centuries, that were, think about Brazil and India, post-colonial societies that were the recipients of Western imperialism for centuries, now having a voice. And how does that kind of post-imperial, post-colonial vision of the world make its way onto the global stage? So this is something that I think we have to keep in mind. The other general point that I hope will help orient us today is to think about ways in which rising states might want to contest the old order. And that's really what we see, contestation over the old order by rising states. And it seems to me there are three major ways in which rising states may clash with the old states. The first one is, this is Mearsheimer, this is the realist vision. And it's very real, and it's historically grounded in the way in which we've seen rising states in the past. Rising states seeking to project power, to turn power into purpose, to push outward from their borders and cast a shadow, to build a sphere of influence, to have more control over the maritime waters around the state, to use and build a navy. At some point in the 21st century, China's going to have the first or second largest navy in the world. They're already looking, and it's a long game, it's a long process, but they are in the process of having a world-class navy. They're not there yet, they're very inferior. The Japanese have a much better navy than the Chinese. The Japanese have a fabulous navy. They're one of the most highly regarded navies in the world. It's kind of a best-kept secret, but they are a very sophisticated naval power all the way from the 19th century onward. So that's one kind of clash. It's what you see in the South China Sea. It's what you see in the East China Sea. It's between Japan and China. The U.S. is clearly finding itself drawn into Asia as a counterweight to the rise of China. That's power goals creating contestation. The second type of clash is ideological and value-driven. And this is really what I was talking about when I was raising the issue of China as the first non-Western world power to have the largest economy, if that's what happens in the next decade. Old ideologies and values are replaced by new ideologies and values pushed forward by the rising states that have a very different value structure. This is a type of struggle over the norms and the values of the international order. I'm going to suggest that this is not what we're seeing today, that this is not the core story of power transitions today, that there is power struggle, and there is more than value struggle, there's a struggle that I'm going to call a struggle over authority. It's a struggle over who gets a seat at the table, who gets to have the rights and privileges of being a great power. It's the shifting of the composition of the political hierarchy. It's not a change of the international order, it's a change of who's kind of the pecking order, who's at the top and who's in the middle and all of that. That's a struggle that's definitely going on, a struggle of authority over replacing American hegemony with something new, but not necessarily a struggle over what I'll call a liberal order. And indeed, I'm going to try to argue yet another book. This is one I really like, the one I wrote. Liberal Leviathan, a slightly provocative title, kind of waving a red flag for people to argue with me about the U.S. as a kind of global power for the second half of the 20th century. The book was really about, well, what did it do? And there's a good story, there's a bad story, there's the dark side, the light side, and all of that. This painting is by a 1920s American impressionist painting, Child Haslam, who was painting. This is flags right after World War I on Fifth Avenue in New York City. This painting is in the Princeton University Art Museum, but the sister painting, almost exactly like it, is hanging in the Oval Office in the White House. And when you see Barack Obama sitting at his desk in the Oval Office, if you can see, if the camera is wide enough, you'll see a painting on his left when you're looking at him. It's this painting. So my idea is, when he goes into a bookstore, he sees my book, he said, Michelle, let's buy that book. I know that, you know. So we'll see. But my thesis, partly reflected in that book, is that there is more of a kind of liberal story of not just a realist story of rise and decline in the 21st century. That in some sense the most striking feature of today's global power transition is that rising states, China, but also Brazil, India, Korea, Turkey, Mexico, South Africa, a rising group of states are rising up within rather than around the rules and institutions created over the last 60 years. Put differently, that the rise of a new generation of states with more power, not necessarily superpower reach, but with regional and global influence increasingly, are constituencies for liberal international order, by which I mean openness of the system and at least loosely rule-based or multilateral. So in this sense, the constituencies for a liberal international order are constituencies for an order that is not based on empire, not based on blocks, not based on closed regions, not based on narrow spheres of influence, despite Putin's best efforts to reconstitute, as some might argue, a kind of Russian sphere. And we can talk about Russia in the question and answer, but for me, when we hear people say what Putin is doing in Ukraine is a 19th century kind of act of geopolitics, they're in some sense saying that they don't want to go back to that is an older style logic, and we are now in a different world where we enshrine openness and, loosely at least, rule-based, agreed upon, consensual international rules and institutions that manage this openness. The struggle today is, I argue, is about authority, about a voice, about who gets to sit at the table, about revising the political hierarchy, but it's not about rival models of modernity. China and Russia don't have that. And it's not even about rival ideologies of order, although Putin does have an ideology that is illiberal, but that is an outlier, as I will argue. I want to try to make good on that claim. I've just given you my argument. It's summarized here. And what I want to do is kind of basically talk about China in particular, but get to the broader class of rising states by saying, why do I argue that? Why do I argue that there is another era of liberal internationalism before us that will guide the international order even as we see these power transitions? And I think I've got about 5 different reasons, and this will be a very liberal kind of argument. The first one is, in some sense, the most important. It's an argument about the nature of the existing order. We'll call it the old order, and it's the order that has been around for 60 or 70 years. It's one that we still live in today. It came forward in the mid-20th century after the convulsive, the most violent and destructive war in human history, and the shift in power was more dramatic than any that we've seen before. And there was a kind of new type of order, a novel kind of order that had all sorts of characteristics that we can talk about. I want to talk about 4 characteristics, but I want to, the main image I want to convey to you is that the realists among us who talk about the rise and decline of states and the rise and decline of order tend to kind of see, they follow the rising state up, and they say, okay, it's powerful now, what will it want to do? But they never talk about the old order that the rising state rises up and greets. So think of rising states rising up, they look up to see what the old order is, and what they see is different in each century. And what China sees, and what Brazil and India, the BRICS, and then what I'll call the next cohort of what middle states, which include Turkey and several other countries, is a order that is more formidable in both good and bad ways. That is to say, it has more incentives to get inside of it and more difficulties of trying to run around it. And the term I've used here is it's easy to join and hard to overturn. And so I put a lot of my chips on the table by saying that China in particular will have a hard time overturning this order, and quite frankly won't want to when it thinks about its interests other than acquiring greater authority. 4 characteristics I think are most important in capturing the old order that rising states face. The first one is, compared to other orders in world history, it's more integrative. Think about how countries have globbed onto it. In the first instance, I should say, Germany and Japan, which remarkably after World War II, almost like a dime, turned and became members of this system. They were occupied, but they became democracies, they integrated, and then Germany and Japan became the second and largest economies and part of this kind of structure. So integration, and then you think of other states across the different decades in various ways making political transitions, many of them away from military rule or authoritarian rule, most of them moving towards capitalism, a kind of international style capitalism, and integrating into this big trading system. We call it globalization, with people moving and corporations investing and trading and so forth. So integration, very important feature that has brought more countries into this system. Secondly, shared leadership. There's kind of a multi-layered political governance system today that's complicated. It's partly the United Nations, it's partly this so-called G system, G7, G8, now G8's having problems, but G20, the kind of expansion, elastic kind of form of governance, finding mechanisms to bring countries together. And G20, which has become kind of the ceremonial, at least, the seat of legitimacy of global governance. The Security Council increasingly has a legitimacy problem because the P5 don't represent the new power reality of the world. And it hasn't for a long time because Germany and Japan have been powerful, but they haven't had nuclear weapons, and there's kind of a discriminatory feature to the UN Security Council is that only nuclear weapon states are permanent members, those that were original members. And so as time goes on, that still is an important body. We still, if you want to settle international disputes, you still want to go to the Security Council, but we need other mechanisms, and the G20 has been kind of that, looking for legitimacy wherever you can find it. And even if they don't, these so-called G groups are not treaty-based, they're kind of informal leadership groups. They don't always work very well, but they provide a forum where China and other states, Saudi Arabia is in the G20, Russia, of course, as well. And so you have a kind of mechanism for shared leadership. Thirdly, there is what I call the sharing the profits of modernity. The world is not an empire in the sense that the profits for openness are flowing to different countries, not from down to up like a colonial empire, but across the system. And China is, of course, the new wealthy state. China, if you would travel the world, you see the new China. You see the tourists who are spending money because they've made fabulous amounts of money, and the kind of rising middle class in China. It's true of India and other countries as well. So this kind of sense of economic spreading of the wealth, that is partly basically because we live in an international capitalist system, and capitalism is transnational, and it moves around very quickly, and so it spreads the economic benefits. A fourth characteristic is pluralism. That is to say, remarkably, and I hadn't really thought about this until recently, there are at least 3 models of development that are encapsulated within what we'll call the liberal international order. And one is, in some sense, the most controversial, the laissez-faire, or the neoliberal model, which America and Britain in the era of Reagan and Thatcher, and then Larry Summers and Robert Rubin in the Clinton years, and onward. There's still a little bit of the Washington Consensus. It's a very, deregulation, privatization, market fundamentalism kind of vision of the relationship between states and markets. A second model is an older model that I have argued has been very successful, but it's more of what I would call a social democratic model. The term that scholars use is embedded liberal model. And this is a model where it's not open markets at any expense, it's more social welfare, safety nets, it's unemployment insurance, job retraining, it's the welfare state. It's a much more European, Western European model of capitalism. And then a third model, which would be a kind of state-led development model, which you see in East Asia, starting with Japan, the kind of state, the MITI, remember the MITI, the Ministry of International Trade and Industry, and of South Korea, state-led, very technocratic, bureaucratic-driven modernization strategy. You see it in various, to some extent in Turkey, you see it in all parts of the world now, but it's a kind of late development, state-led, but it's very market-friendly and international. And in some ways, that is the third model that has been kind of inside of the system. And as I said, I think it's been most prevalent in East Asia during the period of the development of the so-called tigers, the East Asian tigers, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore. So this is a way of saying that the old order, it has a lot of dynamism in it. It's not simply something that you can just kind of push on and it will crumble to the floor. There's a lot of complexity, a lot of articulated institutions, layers of authority, and lots of different institutions that are playing a role. And that is new. In the 19th century, when Britain was the leading economy, you didn't have very many institutions. You had the British Navy, you had the gold standard, and you had a kind of capital markets that were open, labor mobility, but you didn't have really a set of regimes to manage the global system. So that's new. And I think that has some consequences for how to think about rise and decline. The second factor, again, starting with China, is really about what the old order is when you tear away all the ideology and get to the bare bones. And this is my claim about liberal internationalism as a mechanism for organizing the world. And it seems to me the two most important features that are at the core of the current order are features that rising states want. And the first feature is openness. You can't get rich as a society in the 21st century unless you trade and invest across borders. You can't be a North Korea, you can't be a Cuba, you can't be an Iran. You need to be a South Korea. You need to be a country that is trading and investing and acquiring technology and finding niches where you move to the top. All that good stuff that people study in business school and international political economy classes. So openness to trade, to investment, to knowledge, the trading state, getting involved, looking for deals, finding ways to advance in an open system. This is the story of why we have rising states today, that there was a kind of movement, a pivot towards openness and towards international trade expansion as a development strategy in the 60s and 70s, and it's still very much alive today. The second feature are rules and institutions, which sound very liberal, sound like they might be kind of Western ideas, but no, rules and institutions are not Western. They're functional tools for any society that has people in that society that want to protect what they have. So what I want to suggest here is that rising states are rising because they have more things that they've acquired, more property, more capital, more wealth. And if that's how you see them as rising states, what do they want? Well, they want to be able to protect what they have and get more of it. And what I put here, rising states want to protect their equities. And this is in some sense, to kind of almost be philosophical for a moment, this is sort of what the rise of the modern state was about. The rise of property rights, the rise of rule of law. It is about not just weak people trying to protect themselves from the strong. It's about wealth holders and entrepreneurial types trying to protect their equities. And John Locke, the father of liberalism, he talks about property rights. And when you look at China today, it wants to find ways to tie down and secure the wealth that it's acquiring, and find ways to rationalize it so that the government can use it and redeploy it. All of this is what all rising states have done in the past, and you need rule of law. And that's not a Western thing, it's not an Eastern thing, it's not a Northern thing, it's not a Southern thing. So I want to try to redefine what liberalism is to some extent. It's really about rules that protect people's interests. And that's a universal type of dynamic. It's not a values dynamic. It's what C.B. Macpherson in his famous book on liberalism argues as the core logic. So China and other rising states are not a bloc. This is another important feature of the system that I think is very important to keep in mind, and that is that for there to be a kind of new world order, it seems to me that you're going to need to have not just China, but a kind of new counter-hegemonic bloc. Maybe certainly Russia and China, but other states as well. And here I would say, look around the world at rising states, and what do you see? You see diversity. You see different regions, different leaders in different regions. You don't see a global bloc. Almost all are capitalist. Most of these rising states are democratic. They have different geopolitical interests, energy, trade, regionalism, security. They have different agendas. Think about Brazil. Brazil and China, that's a very interesting dynamic. They're two of the BRICS. It's the B and the C. You wouldn't have BRICS without the B and the C. You'd have, what, IS or something. You wouldn't be able to even pronounce it, at least I wouldn't. Brazil is more of a, it has a very ambivalent view of China. If you travel in Brazil, you get a feel for the sense that, yes, China is a fellow BRIC member, but it's also, in some sense, the source of a certain slow de-industrialization of Brazil. There's a new kind of discourse in Brazil about the new kind of neo-colonialism. It's Chinese investment taking resources out of Brazil, but also taking some of the old industry out of Brazil. And you see when finance ministers come to Brasilia, the U.S. finance minister 2 years ago, Brazil and the U.S. issued a statement criticizing Chinese currency policy. So there's a lot of different views when the U.S. and Brazil get together, and there's a problem between the U.S. and Brazil. There has been a kind of grievance of that goes way back, of course, but more recently the NSA spying system, all of that has created a real cold shoulder kind of relationship. But Obama, when he was in Brasilia, he met with Dilma, and I have it on good authority that he asked Dilma, what is your agenda? And Dilma said, my agenda is infrastructure, clean energy, education, and science and technology. And Obama looked at her and said, well, that's my agenda. You know, we're trying to do the same thing. And if you think about rising and declining states, they're all troubled democracies that have rising populations that are asking for more, that are getting a government that isn't fully performing well. There's a lot of debt. There are social safety net issues, an aging population that you can't cover their pensions. There's the energy problem that everybody's experiencing. And so, in some sense, we're in the 21st century, and we're in a century where world politics is the problems of democracy for a large number of countries, East and West, North and South. And for me, that tells us that, not that to be optimistic about the future, but the problems are not geopolitics in the 19th century sense. They're not realist problems. They're problems of how do we get our societies to function? How do we get the garbage to be picked up? How do we get our waters to be made cleaner? And how do we get our children to be schooled? So those are functional problems that are not cultural or regional problems, they're global problems. And so I think that there's not a block here that is going to coalesce around China. If there were, I think my argument starts to break down a little bit. The fourth issue is really about a broader set of dynamics that I tried to foreshadow earlier, and that is that even the idea of BRICS is a misleading optic for looking at the world. That rather than look at the rise of China or the rise of BRICS and how they are attempting to turn the old order on its head, what you probably should look at is the rise of a broader set of countries that I will call, and since I've been at Oxford this year, I've been using this term because it sort of came to me when I was at the British Academy in the fall, a kind of global middle class. And I don't mean that in the economic sense of global middle class that runs across the world, but state middle class. That is to say, middle powers, what we used to call middle powers, which include the old middle powers, Canada and Australia, but a broader set of countries, India and Brazil, Mexico, Indonesia, South Korea, Turkey, and then Australia and Canada. And these states are similar in one respect in that they are seeking more voice inside of their region and globally, and they are exhibiting what I call stakeholder mentality, which means pushing for more multilateral cooperation because that protects them from the stronger states, and influencing world politics through agenda setting, bridge building, and coalition diplomacy. Because you got to work together. You got to get people to change the agenda, to put this on the UN agenda rather than that, to try to change the distribution of power through building coalitions. South Korea, for me, is a good example of this. South Korea, a country that, as a liberal, I think of South Korea as a kind of encapsulates this transition that I've been talking about. South Korea was run until the 1980s by a military regime. The father of the current president of South Korea was the military head of South Korea for many years. His wife was killed by an assassin, North Korean assassin, who was trying to get the president. South Korea has gone through this both economic and political transition. It has found itself moving not just in East Asia to try to secure itself. It's got problems with North Korea for sure. It's got problems with Japan and China. But during the last 10 years, South Korea has pursued a kind of what it calls a kind of ideology of global Korea. That Korea is no longer simply defined by its struggles with the North. It's defined by its efforts to get into the global game of governance. So South Korea hosted the second nuclear safety summit after Washington, then this year it was in The Hague as the third meeting. This is very important gathering of over 40 heads of state to try to make sure that the nuclear capacities are secure and monitored. It has been the host of the G20. It has been the host of innumerable energy fora, clean energy fora. Sustainable development is a Korean theme. A bridge building between North and South. Korea is the first country that was a recipient of ODA, Official Development Assistance, that now is the benefactor of ODA. It used to get it, now it's giving it. That's a story of the 21st century. That is a story of a country that has moved into a new position in the system. And of course, anybody who's been in Korea, you're unbelievably impressed by the education system. Young Koreans work, 14 hours a day they study. My son, who's 14 years old, he studies about 30 minutes a day. I say, you have it easy. My son, you should go to South Korea. You'd still be studying till midnight and getting up earlier. So there's a kind of a work ethic, and you see it in the kind of attempt to move to the next level in the kind of platform of the economy towards high tech. Samsung and all that is part of it. Soft power. It's not just the K-pop, but it's more generally. There's a very dynamic. This is a country, South Korea, like Singapore, is one of those countries that we call in the United States punching above its weight. It's throwing a stronger punch than you would expect given the size. And so I think that there is a whole set of countries that are rising that don't get the glamour, don't get the attention. Some of it is because they're rising up and trying to, I think as Turkey is, try to articulate a vision for its region, for the Balkans, for the greater Middle East. Sometimes it is in the kind of global arena, doesn't always work. There are lots of different toes that are stepped upon. There's old states that are not quite ready to make room for new states. But that is a dynamic that is playing itself out across regions, mostly by states that are democracies. Think of the G20. 17 of the G20 countries are democracies. The only non-democracies are Russia, China, and Saudi Arabia. And those 17 countries, which include, of course, the old Western European states and many of the states I've just mentioned, if they can get their political footing and regain their economic growth, there's a lot of trouble with democracy today. Countries like Venezuela and Russia have moved back from democracy. But for me, giving a kind of liberal view to you, to kind of counteract the Mearsheimer view of 2 years ago, I do pay attention to democracy and the changing nature of the regimes that make up the system, particularly the rising middle class. Final point about rising states, again, if I can be right on China, I think I can be right at the global level because they are the critical country to look at. China is not a model for the world. Now, there's something called the Beijing Consensus, and if you find out who's arguing that there's a Beijing Consensus, it's almost always Americans. You don't have the Chinese saying we have a model, because they know they don't yet. And Chinese are more impressed by their own vulnerabilities than by their strengths, although you can find plenty of Chinese thinkers who have a grand vision of China in the future and how that they are going to have this day when they are able to redo the international order. But they don't have a model of modernity. And this is where I'll step back into my scholar's role and say that to have the kind of dynamic impact on the global system, a rising state needs to be a kind of vanguard model that other countries want to emulate. Now, the US, and before that Britain, played that role for many decades, even centuries. Some would say that the US, after 2008, lost that role, that the financial crisis was a crisis made in America. And that's true. The US form of capitalism is no longer a desired model in many ways. The financial dominance of finance capitalism in Wall Street the neoliberal kind of impulse is not very popular around the world. And it may or may not be that in 20 years the US economy will kind of come back. It has a lot going for it in terms of demography and innovation, Silicon Valley, the next generation of Steve Jobs. Yes, I did know Steve Jobs. He visited me at Princeton. He wanted to use my office, and I had an IBM. So I said, oh, sorry, no Apple. But the kind of, there's still some life left in, I think, the American economy. But even if the U.S. is no longer in that role, I think it's very hard to say that China or Russia is in that role, certainly Russia. So if you aren't a new model of modernity, it's going to be very hard for you to have this kind of sweeping impact on the world. Finally, about China, China knows this really, and China is much more of a stakeholder state than many people think. In the old days, after Deng Xiaoping came to power, there was still in China a great deal of attention to the ideology of what we call the new international economic order. That is to say, this vision that grew up in the 70s of a kind of radical critique of the Western world economy, the new international economic order. And China was a spokesman for that for many years, if you follow government and party documents. Sometime around 2007 in the party congress, China started changing their language to talk about the world economy, and it became much more status quo. It was language like the translation would be justice, fairness, which always meant in the next sentence that China should have more voice in the IMF, the World Bank, and the WTO. So it was much more of a let's rise up inside of the system and get more authority so that we can do things that will serve our interests. And that's not a revisionist ideology. So China is much more boring and status quo than you might think when it comes to economic issues. And when you ask the Chinese what they would want, if their wish list for the Chinese impact on the world economy, the three things that are always first, second, and third are greater role in the IMF and World Bank, secondly, more influence in these leadership coalitions like the G20, and thirdly, the internationalization of the renminbi, of the yuan currency. And all those things are understandable. And the third agenda item, internationalization of the Chinese currency, would be a game changer if China had a currency that everybody wanted and wanted to store value in. That would put China in a whole new position. But to get that, China is going to need to do domestically things that will make people want to invest in the Chinese currency, property rights, business law, banking sector, deepening of financial markets. And that means that to build up, you've got to build down. You've got to build the foundations, less corruption. Everybody who wants to invest in China, you've got to go to Hong Kong or Shanghai. You've got to find elites who are part of the power structure who will protect you and help underwrite your investments and the security of those investments. That's a sign that it's not yet a global economy in the sense of a world economy that can be used for the world system itself. It's still a spoiler economy, still taking advantage of the system rather than trying to transform it. So the final point I would make is that a lot of the turmoil and upheaval in the global system today is a sign of success. It's not something to be unhappy about, even from an American perspective where you see over the decades ahead you're going to lose power. The American century will end, the US will be less hegemonic. Some people around the world will be glad about that, some people will be sad about that, some people will try to keep it going longer than might otherwise be the case. There still are, as I've argued today at the Foreign Ministry, unique advantages the US has that will keep it as a leading power for many, many decades, and probably more so than China, even as China grows. But it's going to be a more democratic world order, and that is a sign of a success. If you build an international order that's open and loosely rule-based, that what I've described as liberal internationalism, you should expect states to rise up. and to take authority away from you, because you've created the conditions for the spread of these sorts of things. So it's a problem, the problems of success, problems of how do we integrate rising states and how do we deal with the problems of interdependence. The two great global problems of the 21st century. How do you integrate rising states and how do you deal with problems of interdependence? Those are problems of success. You wouldn't have rising states, you wouldn't have problems of interdependence if you didn't have an open system with at least some modicum of rules. So it seems to me going forward, and this is my conclusion, that the liberal vision has some purchase on the future, even despite the very persuasive arguments of realists that power transitions are dangerous and contested. They have some purchase, liberals do, on the future, because they don't just see the column, one column that says the problems of power transition. They see the incentives of stakeholders in an interdependent world, rising problems and opportunities of interdependence, economic interdependence, security interdependence, that the solutions to the problems that we have today can't be national solutions. They have to be international solutions. Or to use a little bumper sticker of mine, you can't be secure alone, you can only be secure together. And it seems to me that if that is true, that there will be a new generation of liberal internationalists that won't necessarily speak English and won't live in America or Western Europe, but will be all over the world, including in China, where they already exist, although they keep their heads down. And so the constituencies for an open system that has a bit of a rule-based system with a promise of justice, not a real justice yet, but that's a world that it seems to me even declining states would say is a world that they should be happy to be in, because it's a world that aspires, as John F. Kennedy said, it aspires to be a world where the weak are safe and the strong are just. So with that, I say thank you for coming, and I look forward to your comments and questions.
Now we have almost 25 minutes for Q&A session, and we have a mobile microphone, I guess. Okay. Would you mind directing all questions? Or
should I pick?
Yeah, okay.
Okay, please, sir. And just give us your name and maybe where you're.
I'm Dr. Barishella from Okay, I can shout a little.
Yeah. I think that I can hear you. So.
Professor, I jotted down some notes while we were presenting. The mere existence of the second stage of your goals, I mean the ideological and value goals you mentioned, it seems to me at least in conflict with your argument that we're living more of a liberal world and not a realist world or a cultural world. Because you said it's more about democracy and the domestic office approach, how to make it, how to make our societies function better. Yet, even between liberal democracies, between Europe and the United States, we see different versions of democracies and how to debate it, I mean, discussions, and let alone the liberal democracies or China or the Russian policies. And in Europe and the United States, when they're between a rock and a hard place, they forget about democracy most of the time because they feel the need to do what they need to do, as the national security strategies, also in the United States, say, you know, better than me. So, not in the 19th century style, but people, the realist concerns dress up differently and in a new form, maybe in a new way, underlie the tenets of liberal world that you present. In that sense, I mean, I think, don't you think, epistemologically, realism and liberalism are like father and like son. So it's not that easy to refute Mersheimer, maybe, not at all points. I mean, myself, I'm kind of followed with your presentation, but this is the first one, and I know I had a long question on the presentation. One sentence, second question. What is given this framework, what does a liberal outlook say about Putin, Georgia case, and the recent Ukraine? Yeah. Because all you present is it's beautiful, okay, but there is no mention of international order enforcement strategies, the choice of the strategic factors. How do we do it?
Those are great questions, very challenging questions, and I guess what I can start with the kind of more philosophical version of the question and try to gauge it. In some ways, I think the liberal vision is not denying the realist problems of world order, but trying to say that you can go beyond them and you can solve some of those problems. So think about if I were to give a lecture in international relations to students, I would say that there have been two great order building projects over the last centuries. One is a realist project, what we call it the Westphalian project, that begins with 1648 and all these world wars, 1713, 1815, 1919, 1945, 1989. There have been these kind of upheavals and rebuilding and expanding and deepening the global state system, enshrining national self-determination, state sovereignty, non-discrimination, so forth. The liberal project of building a more complex forms of cooperation around rights and multilateralism is premised on some success of the Westphalian project, which is to say solving Mearsheimer problems. Mearsheimer thinks those problems are never fully solved. Mearsheimer thinks that every great power is kind of a Nazi Germany waiting to get out. And I said, that's not true. You know, he takes the two most dangerous countries, Japan and Nazi Germany, and says those are the archetypes. And I say those are the outliers. That actually most states are not offensive realists, they're security seekers, and they want, if anything, they want a more soft realist world where there is a kind of balance of power and there's acquiescence to a kind of norms of stability. So to put it more philosophically, you have to solve the problems of Hobbes to make good on the promise of Locke. So if the world starts to go back to a realist world of competition and power politics, which Putin is kind of you can't go back into history and use it to explain a lot of stuff. And it's precarious. And almost all liberalism is a kind of dirty liberalism in the sense that it's hypocritical and you're trying to often do the second best.
it's not trying to make a perfect world, it's trying to get the best you can in an imperfect world. You're often forced with these very, very dangerous and difficult decisions. Do you try to push democracy on countries that may not want it, or that may produce democracy for the first election and then no democracy for the second and third? So there are all these different situations. Look at the way the U.S. struggled with Egypt. There's no happy policy for Egypt. What do? I think you try to support elected leaders, and you say that in the end, if you're in favor of democracy, you should be in favor of whatever party or people gets elected by democracy. But we all know that doesn't always have a happy ending, so there's not necessarily, that may not be the end of the story. So liberalism is trying to, as Kennedy said, bend history. It's a practical kind of internationalism of finding ways where you can get agreements, where you can establish systems where we can solve problems. And we do know that great powers can develop stable relationships. We have concepts such as restraint and accommodation and balance. From the Congress of Vienna in 1815 and onward, great powers have found ways to solve their differences. Russia, Putin, is clearly unhappy with the West and is not a liberal internationalist by any means. He is a kind of 19th century leader in a 21st century world, and the world is saying, wow, this is not right. And you can do that in your own backyard, on the borders with peoples who you can in some sense use a kind of irredentist strategy of fomenting unrest in Russian-speaking zones and then try to use that as an excuse for intervention or intimidate or build a sphere of influence. That's a very old notion. And he supports, and they support him, built on oil exports that are not going to last forever, and on a demographic society that is shrinking, that has one of the shortest mortality rates in the world, people dying early. It's a shrinking, it's not a rising power. If you look at Putin today, you cannot say this is the beginning of a new ideology of world order where Russia is waving the flag of the Russian Empire and a new system with Russia at the center of it. It is a weak and paranoid leader who we have to take seriously, and at the center of a country that deserves respect, but that deserves also our resistance as it tries to now take more slices of Ukraine, even as we speak. So I think it's a story of weakness, and it's a story that is not going to be a happy one for Putin or for Russia, even in the medium term.
First of all, thank you very much for your thought-provoking speech. Giray Sadık, I'm a faculty member, Yıldırım Beyazıt University. I have two interrelated questions. First, you mentioned that new powers are rising as a result of US established order, and they have some good reasons, mostly liberal internationalist reasons, to remain within the scope of the game. Well, do you think that it is for now? You observe the world, that makes sense, it's intuitive, but in the long run, do you think they are likely to remain in that, or they are using it until they are powerful enough so that they can challenge the system, they can change that? Let's say, do you think if China was instead of Russia, are there any reasons observing Chinese policies to expect them to be more tolerant, especially seeing how they act in Turkestan or in Tibet with respect to their own problems? And my second question is more about theory. You mentioned now 2 times also as an answer, and in your speech, that Russia is an outlier or a kind of outlier. I mean, then it's quite a big outlier. It's not a Luxembourg to say just, oh, you know, it's outlier. And in that respect, yes, I do agree with your observation about Russia, that it may not be a model. So as we may say that China, in that sense, not that kind of liberal model as US aspired and have been for a while. But do they really care? Thank you.
Those are good questions. China, will it stay on a path towards integration? And that's a good question. There are thinkers, Yang Zhetung and other intellectuals in China that blame the liberal order. They don't credit their growth as a trading state to the openness of the system and the rules, the WTO and the rest. They see that their success is based on their own ideas, and they are looking for the day when they can project those ideas. And they're in some sense searching for those ideas. Sometimes Confucianism is being rediscovered as a kind of identity, and other kind of ideas from the period of the so-called tribute system model for 1,000 years, the imperial system in Asia, which had really Korea, Vietnam, and Japan as secondary states in a kind of informal tribute system. So there are alternative ideas that are inside of the Chinese civilization. It's a kind of civilization state, and so you could argue that when it becomes more powerful, it will then be able to ignore all the old commitments and spring something new on the world. Part of the liberal argument is that there's a kind of coevolution, that they will, and already have to some extent, seen a kind of new forces in their societies that want to stay connected and play by a kind of set of rules that the rest of the world wants to play by. The rise of a kind of business elite. You saw this in Japan in the 60s and 70s. Keidon ran. I spent a year in Japan working with the international business groups who were slowly kind of going from a nationalist orientation to an internationalist orientation. My view kind of is premised on more of that happening inside of China, and it may not. I may be wrong there, and that would be part of the story. But the way, the realist would say, this is Steve Walt, but also John Mearsheimer would say, if you're a poor guy who just works and earns a little bit of a living, you don't think you need a private jet. But if you wake up one day and you're a billionaire, all of a sudden you need a private jet. You want a private jet. So China may today not say we want certain things in the international system, but when they get powerful enough, just like a billionaire, they might want things that they don't want today. And so you can't sort of say, what is China thinking today, and then say that's what they're going to think in 30 years, because when they have more power, they will have other ideas about what their interests are. And that is absolutely true. But the liberal response to that argument is, they may want a private jet, but they will want the FAA. That is to say, they will want international rules about aviation, because they're going to fly their jet. They don't want to fly their jet into another jet. They will want rules, international rules, to continue the analogy for flying their private jets around the world. They will want traffic control and radar and all the rest. So yes, they will want new things in 20 years, but they will want rules in 20 years, not just ways to project domination on other countries. So we're making different bets about the future. There's also this scale and scope issue, which is very important to me. China is different than Japan in that it's just bigger. And it's conceivable that China will be able to generate new sets of rules for the world based on their domestic system. The problem with that view is that they're going to need other countries that will want to buy into their ideas, and I've suggested that they aren't getting that, quite interestingly. And secondly, they are going to need to be able to find a different type of modernization that doesn't require capitalism and the rule of law, because in 20 years,
they will want that unless there's a kind of new model of modernity that I cannot quite envisage at the moment, a kind of authoritarian, closed system, and it's very difficult to see how that works on a global scale. So I see them more as either a spoiler or a stakeholder. Russia was, your question was an outlier. Is that right? You were
too big to be an outlier. Russia is too big to be an outlier. That was my question. What do you think about it?
I don't agree. I think that one of the things that is going to happen, and has already happened with the Ukraine crisis, is that they are becoming more of an outlier. Even China did not vote for them when that is to say, vote against the Ukrainian resolution in the General Assembly. Nor did Brazil or India. They abstained. The Americans are very angry because Israel didn't even show up. And that was like, how many times has America vetoed resolutions against Israel in the UN, and then the one time we needed Israel to vote for us, they didn't show up. Thanks a lot. But you can tell I'm really angry about that, because I think it was a moment that we will think about for a long time. But Russia is more isolated today. There's not going to be a G8 that they're going to be a member of. They've been disinvited. I do want to make one. I've been very tough on Russia today. I do think that the Western countries made a mistake with Russia at the end of the Cold War. There was a vision of what the world would look like that Gorbachev and Reagan had, which was a view of Russia as a big power that would be kind of equal to the other big powers and be focused on arms control and disarmament. And Russia collapsed after the Cold War and became it had an economy the size of Denmark. The economic transition failed, this kind of neoliberal model, which was a disaster. It sold off all these state assets to the oligarchs, created this very unequal system, which made it very difficult for democracy to last. And then the oil industry as the dominant industry, all of that has created a very unhappy environment for democracy and a very happy environment for Putinism. And it was partly NATO expansion, missile defense, and pipeline politics that are the grievances that Russia, even pre-Putin, before Putin was Putin, or Medvedev, let's say, his view, much more friendly to the West, much more we can do business, more transactional kind of leadership. Even there were grievances. And in some ways, while this is not an excuse for Putin, we helped make Putin possible by not finding more creative ways to bring Russia into a system that would be more fair and more legitimate from their perspective. Please, in the back. Last question.
Last two questions, but quick ones.
Yes, they got to be good ones, as they have been.
Birger Tüfekçi from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Mr. Ikenberry, I would like to ask you, how would you define, if I say, I find your arguments kind of utopic, because as far as I know from your writings, you find NATO a successful institution. And when we look at NATO's structure, we will see almost all nations, almost all members carry same values, same cultural and political values. But you here try to create a new institutional system in which global order exists. So how can China manage this? Thank you.
Utopia, but I'll definitely try to. One more, right? Would you like? Yes, please. Why don't you?
Actually, I was the one who.
You were first. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Ikenberry. I would like to take from your point on, you said rising states need to be a vanguard model that other states want to emulate, and I quote from you. My question is about this model. I would like to make references to John Locke and John Stuart Mill. The first one talks about the rights of life, liberty, and property, and the second one talks about progress, individualism, and individual liberties. I think these are the basis of the success and established powers of the old system. So about China and the other potential rising states, I could not hear much from you about domestic politics, political participation, and social media, which is now an informal channel of political participation. And last point is, you mentioned about global problems that these rising states are working on. And I would like to hear your take on the theory of risk society and reflexive modernity. Because right now we're in a different sociological period where we are now living with the adverse effects of capitalism. Right now, we need to focus more on the needs of individuals and protect our own societies. So I'd like to hear more on that. Thank you.
Very good. On the first question, I am trying to, I'm trying to, there's kind of an idealism that I am drawn to, in the sense that in American debates about international relations, particularly in the not just the realists, but the neoconservatives that have been so powerful in American foreign policy making, I'm partly trying to remind people of aspects of the world that have worked and that can be built upon. And so in some sense, I accent the positive, as the old song goes. That is to say, I'm trying to abstract out of the system things that are innovations. The way in which France and Germany were able to compose their differences through the coal and steel community and create integration. The way in which Japan, in a kind of context of an alliance system, was able to regenerate its growth without becoming a militarized great power. The 20th century has had these kind of revolutions in international politics that realists don't identify and don't appreciate. So I'm kind of waving a flag and saying, look there, look here, look there. There are things that we can build on. It's not entirely a story of dog eat dog, and there is evolution, there is innovation, updating. It can fall apart, but it's not simply a rise and decline. It's not, as Hegel said, the owl of Minerva rises at dusk. That's a metaphorical way of saying that enlightenment comes at the very end after it's too late. It said, oh my God, if I would have known that at noon and not at the end of the day, I could have changed my behavior. I think the owl of Minerva rises at noon, so you can make adjustments, you can learn, but it's a very sober, kind of almost melancholy kind of liberalism of looking for second best, and in the midst of a lot of dangers, trying to extract lessons and build on success, and do harness your future on democracy, which is a kind of system of protecting and countering power and reducing the concentration of power. That kind of historic commitment, which is always imperfect, is something we need to seize upon and try to build on, because more of the world than ever before has wanted to move in that direction. And there are things called legitimacy. It's a weak discipline for world politics, but when people like Putin are seen as illegitimate internationally, they can still do what they're doing and say, I don't care, I don't even know what that word means. But the world does, and it's not a strong discipline on power, but it is a discipline that we want to try to nurture a little bit, because it's going to be a difficult century with all the problems. So I think that's, and then that, just very briefly, it seems to me that one of the virtues of a kind of liberal order is that it allows for a lot of diversity, a lot of different models, and no one country has all the answers. Australia has found ways of promoting voting. Germany has apprentice systems for worker training that are world class. Britain must have something. Britain, well, I'm living there this year, the health system is fabulous. You're sick, you go, you don't even have to tell them who you are, you get treated. There are different countries with lots of different socio-economic systems that are first
first in their class, so to speak. I've already spent a lot of time on South Korea, not North Korea, South Korea. So there are, I think you've got to have a system of order where there are lots of diversity and lots of different models of society and economics. Even as domestically they are different, they come to the international system and say, we want openness and we want a modest level of international law and multilateral rules. So that's how I would end it.
Thank you very much, Professor. Please join me. And I'd like to invite our Dean of Faculty to present the special souvenir. And before that, I'd like to pass you a special cover design for your forthcoming book. So it's up to you.
Thank you very much.
It's designed by Şaban kardeş.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Thank you all.
Well, thank you very much indeed. It was a great feast of thought for us and very inspiring. This is just a small remembrance from us. It's a bit heavy to carry on all the way back.
Thank you. So you can all see it.
Please look at it.
Thank you.